We're going to spend a little time during a very confusing time, which was when primates arose. Where did they arise? When did they arise? What did they come from? And that's a question that is still being widely debated. Here you see a cladogram of primates, the lemurs, lorises, tarsiers, which are sometimes collectively called prosimians, and the anthropoids, New World monkeys, Old World monkeys, apes, and humans. Well, as a little background, look at the geologic time scale. And we're only going to look at the last roughly 65 million years. We know the dinosaurs died out in the late Mesozoic era, right at the Cretaceous Tertiary boundary, which is sometimes called the KT boundary, K an abbreviation for Cretaceous. And in the Paleocene, the first epoch of the Cenozoic, we begin to see an adaptive radiation of mammals, all sorts of mammal groups. And one of those orders that we may be seeing the glimmerings of, particularly in the late Paleocene, although there's great argument about that, are primates, the order primates. I also wanted to interject before we went any further, because I know there's always discussion about continental drift. We know if we go back 225 million years ago, that there was, the continents were joined up in something called Pangaea. At about 200 million years ago, we see during what's called the Triassic period, we see Gondwanaland in the south, meaning Australia, Antarctica, Africa and South America, and Laurasia in the north, meaning North America and Europe and Asia. And then about 135 million years ago, during the Jurassic period, continents began to move apart a little bit more. And then in the Cretaceous period, 65 million years ago, Europe and Africa and Asia were still slightly in contact, whereas today, as you can see, our continents are where we see them. Now, just to give you a simple overview, in the later part of the geological time scale, it looks like primates probably emerged in the Eocene. This is when most people would say they find real, true primates. It was in the Miocene, about 25 million years ago, when we saw a great proliferation of apes. That was the age of apes, interestingly. There were apes not only in Africa and in Asia, but also Europe, and there were many different kinds. And then in the Pliocene, we began to see the emergence of hominins, of human fossils, as going back to probably about 6 million years, okay? And in the Pleistocene epoch, we see the emergence of things like Homo, our own genus, and about 200,000 years ago, Homo sapiens. Now, where, when, and why did primates evolve? Well, why did primates evolve? They were one of those mammalian groups that was moving into a new ecological niche and developing its own unique kind of anatomy. Now, what kind of creature did it come out of? Or what's the hypothesis about why primates arose? Well, some people, like F. Wood Jones, think that they spent a lot of time in the trees. They needed grasping organs, hands and feet for climbing around. They needed binocular vision to look in 3D to negotiate that three-dimensional world. They had nails rather than claws so that they had a firmer grip, and so forth and so on. And that many of the adaptations we see in primates were to an arboreal habitat. They were moving from the ground, from a terrestrial world, to an arboreal world. Matt Cartmel, who is professor at Boston University, thinks that, well, squirrels do pretty well in the trees, and they have nails, and they have eyes that face out in different directions. They don't have very good binocular vision, and they do really well in trees. And he suggests that they were feeding on small objects, particularly insects. And he thinks that Many of the adaptations, like binocular vision and so on, are related to eating insects, and that this is a specific adaptation to insectivory, or being generally an insect eater. The question is, where did the first primates arise? In Africa? In Asia? Where were the earliest primates found? Or in North America? When, as I said, probably in the Eocene. Probably in that time period, we see the first real, true primates. Before that, we find sort of proto-primates. So when, to go back to that question, prosimians, things like this loris that's pictured here, probably has its roots way back around 60 million years ago. I wouldn't say 65, but around 60 million maybe. Old world monkeys around 25 million years ago. New world monkeys about 35 million years ago. The lesser apes, as they're sometimes called, gibbons, maybe around 18 million years ago. The great apes, which include orangutans, chimpanzees, gorillas, and you might call us, as some people have called us, the naked ape, humans. So great apes like orangutans probably emerged, had ancestors, as you will see, and we have good evidence for this, about 14 million years ago. Gibbons, maybe a little bit older, about 18 million years ago. Great apes, gorillas, about 12 million years ago. And the common ancestor to chimps and us, probably something like 6, 8, 10 million years ago at the most. Just to give you a little framework. Now, in the Paleocene, which was a period right after the dinosaurs went extinct, people think that the proto-primate probably looked much like a tree shrew. And that is a model that has been used for a number of years. But the question is, was it in Eurasia or North America where these things emerged? Because they were not totally separate, and they could have arisen in either place. Now, in the Paleocene, there's a group called plesiadiforms, and you see a couple of these. One of them, obviously, oddly enough, is called Purgatorius from North America, from Purgatory Hill. But these are creatures that I think were very specialized and weird. If you look at the skull in the top there, you see it has one little incisor sticking out, it has a huge gap between the rest of the teeth. This is not something to me that looks very much like a primate. It doesn't even have a post-orbital bar, which you can see. Post-orbital bar would close the orbit in the back. It doesn't even have that, mind having a completely closed capsule. There are creatures, and I won't bother you with names, but there are some teeth that look primate-like that have been found in North Africa. So if that's the case, maybe they arose in Africa. But let's look at the true primates, the debut of primates of modern aspect. Belong to a couple of different groups, the adapids and the omomyids, and these go back to perhaps 55 million years ago. Now, in the Eocene, tropical rainforests spread much further north, so it would have been easy for these tropical animals to have lived in higher latitudes beginning with the early Eocene. So some of the primates we're talking about they're called adapids and omomyids. About 55 million years ago, found in Europe, North America, Asia, and Africa. They have skeletons similar in many ways to living lemurs. They have a grasping thumb. They have nails rather than claws. They have front-facing orbits. They have this little post-orbital bar that's indicated by this little triangle right there that is on the side of the area that houses the eye, and a slightly bigger brain-to-body ratio. Were these the earliest true primates? The adapids were first sort of recognized by, you remember, Georges Cuvier, the French founder of paleontology. In fact, in 1856, he found a little skull of something he called Adipus, and it was found in the Paris Basin. The Paris Basin, by the way, is limestone, and it shares a lot of primitive features with lemurs and lorises. It had a smallish eye socket, so it was probably diurnal, and some of these adaphids actually have this special grooming claw that some prosimians have. An Adipus parisiensis. Next time you're in Paris, or if you're watching this in Paris, go to Montmartre, and there is a little plaque commemorating an 1856 discovery by Cuvier of what is the first fossil primate to have been found. 1856 is a date you might remember. You will remember because that was the year that the famous Neanderthal skeleton was found in Germany. Ulmammiids have 30 different genera. You see, now you know what a genus is, okay? And there were many species in those genera. And they had shorter, narrower snouts, and they were probably leapers, like contemporary prosimians. Many prosimians are vertical clingers and leapers, as you may remember. Now, we will move on in our next presentation to look at origins of some of the higher primates.